It's not easy being a Christian in the world today. Join us as we discuss theology, church history, cults, philosophy, worldview, and apologetics. Intellectually engaging, humorous, and at times controversial, Ryan and Seth make the subject matter accessible to anyone, whether young or old, skeptical or mature believer. Anchorcast is a ministry of Anchor New England. Welcome to the Anchorcast. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Seth.
And we are here today to talk to you about Christian theology, philosophy, Christian worldview, apologetics, all kinds of good stuff related to the faith. And
from the undisclosed location.
Well, yeah, we're in the bunker today, and we continue to broadcast from this place, and it's a pretty awesome little studio, I must say. And today we're actually going to be talking about this topic of heresies. That's not a word that's in everyone's vocabulary.
It seems like it is if you go online.
Right. And I think this is a super important topic for Christians today because little do we realize, or many people realize, there are a lot of heresies floating around in the church today. You might say that the church has been in some way become a cage for every unclean bird.
Oh, nice. Nice touch.
So that's scary to me, to be honest with you. And I'm concerned about it because we have really not done a very good job of learning from those who have come before us and dealt with a lot of these ideas literally hundreds of years ago. And we see them coming back into style, coming back into popularity, and growing and having a large following within the church. So it's important.
Yeah, and people are oftentimes living in a way that's disconnected from Christian history, and they act as though, or they just don't know that many of these things have been settled, such a long time ago.
Yeah,
I mean,
but if you read the Da Vinci Code,
definitely, yeah,
Dan Brown will tell you otherwise.
You'll learn what it's all about from the Da Vinci Code for sure. But you said that there's many heresies, but in some ways, Satan only has a limited bag of tricks, right? I feel like they all sort of center on certain things.
Yeah. Usually it has to do with the nature of Christ. Like those are the big ones that we see in the church today that I think are of greatest concern to me, have to do with the nature of Christ. And we'll get into those, but why don't we start by maybe talking about what a heresy is? Because people might not be familiar with this word heresy. Do you want to take a crack at it?
Well, I think that as Christians, we would define it as something that departs from Christian orthodoxy.
Yeah. So it's something that a belief or an opinion that's contrary to Christian orthodoxy. Why do you think heresy is such a big problem for the church? I mean, can't people just believe whatever they want to believe as long as they're not hurting anyone?
Well, how do you know you're not hurting anyone if you're going around spreading things that are untrue? Mm-hmm. I mean, the things that you believe affect your behavior, right? I shared the story at my church not that long ago. At at a church that I went to fairly early on in my Christian life. This was several churches ago. I think I was leading a Bible study or an adult Sunday school class or something like that. And a young lady in the group was sharing about, the challenges that she was facing lately in her life, and then sort of summed it up by saying, "Oh, well, even Jesus wasn't perfect." And I was like, actually, if Jesus, I can't remember what I said in that moment, but she actually said something like that again, like the following week, and I said, actually, if Jesus wasn't perfect, then there is no sacrifice for sin, and there's no resurrection, and there's no nothing, and what are we even doing here? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's the kind of heresy that unconsciously creeps into.
Right. She may have sent it in a very innocent kind of way, not realizing.
And I've since thought, maybe she didn't mean it like he's a sinner. Maybe she just meant like even Jesus can get tired and thirsty in his humanity,
right,
and so on. And so there was a sense in which, in his earthly sojourn, he wasn't perfect. He could still be wounded and so on. So maybe I've since thought, well, maybe I was, maybe I should have been more generous toward her. Maybe she didn't mean that he's not perfect, like he's a sinner. Maybe she just meant had in his humanity had not been fully perfected. But
that does get to the question of whether or not all beliefs which purport to be Christian beliefs are equally legitimate and a valid basis upon which to formulate a worldview. There are plenty of people who purport to be Christians, to have Christian beliefs, but they're not Christian beliefs.
I made this comment in our podcast about interpreting the Bible. I said, let's not forget that Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses read the Bible, and they think they have the whole story. You know?
And they claim to be Christian. Yeah. They're very vocal about their Christianity.
Yeah. I was confronted one time on the street by two young ladies who were Mormons and wanted to talk to me, and I said, I'm all set, I'm a Christian. And they said, so are we. Mm-hmm. That can be very beguiling to someone who doesn't know what's up with that.
Well, let's deal with that for a second. So let's talk about Jehovah's Witnesses and the heresy that literally goes all the way back to the time of Arius, who was a pretty influential priest in Alexandria in the 200s. And Arianism maintained that the Son of God, Jesus, was created by the Father and therefore neither co-eternal nor co-substantial. So Jesus is not the same substance or homoousios, as they would put it, as the Father.
And not really divine.
And not divine. He emanates from the Father, or has been created by the Father, and through him, Arius would say other things were created, but he himself is not God in the same way that the Father is God, because he's not eternal. There was a time where he was not, was what Arius would say. And they get this from the Bible. They get this from Colossians. So turn over to Colossians chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 15 through 20. Colossians 1, verses 15 through 20. And the Apostle Paul is writing to the church here, and he says, He, meaning Jesus, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. There it is, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body of the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So right there, right off the bat in verse 15, Clearly, the Bible teaches
he's a creature.
that Jesus was a created being, right? He's the firstborn of all creation. So we see this thinking alive and well in Jehovah's Witness theology. That's exactly what they teach. And yet this was condemned as being heretical centuries ago. And somehow it's made its way back into circulation. And you would think that if we really sort of understood the history of this, we would have an answer for folks who are Jehovah's Witnesses, who claim that this is who Jesus was. Instead, we often see them coming to the door and we're like, oh, quick, close the curtains. Because we don't know what to say. And I really think that that's a problem. It really is. So how do we deal with that? I mean, how do we deal with this issue of not really understanding these particular heresies?
Well, I think we have to do a good job getting this into ourselves, and into our churches and into our kids. And, I mean, if you're preparing specifically for dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses, then certainly you could, write down some points on a piece of paper, because you know that, this afternoon they're probably going to come by, and you can sort of get some arguments lined up. But I mean, just in general, if you are spending the sort of time in the Word and sitting under the preaching of your pastor like you should be, and imbibing all of the richness of Christian orthodoxy, I mean, you'll be ready to make some kind of a defense, even if you haven't written down, okay, here's my 4 bullet points that I want to say to these guys.
Yeah, I think familiarity with what it is that other groups believe, heretical groups, I think is helpful too, just so that when you get to the point where you're having a conversation, you already kind of know what it is that they're going to be pitching. You know what they're going to be talking about. And so you've begun to formulate some ideas around it. One of the things that we have to do is also understand how to interpret Scripture. When we go back to verse 15, and the text says, and the Jehovah's Witness has the Bible open and says, look, right there, your own Bible says that he is created. It says he is the firstborn of all creation. We should be able to understand, or we should know how to answer that.
I'd probably pull the old switcheroo and say, do you think you're going to heaven?
Do you think you're going to heaven? What do you mean by that?
I think Jehovah's Witnesses oftentimes say no, or I'm not sure, because they think they'll just be part of the new creation on earth, and only the spiritual ones go to heaven. So I just like sliding the knife in.
You want to get them on the back foot.
You're not one of the holy ones. Get out of here.
Not yet. You have to be purified.
Yeah.
So this word firstborn actually has not just to do with birth order, but it has to do with preeminence. And back in that culture, in that time, one of the things that we have to understand is that Paul was writing to a people where the firstborn, the eldest son, inherited everything from the father. He was the one who received, he was the beneficiary of all that the father had. And so when Paul is using this language, he's not just talking about it from the perspective of Jesus being a created being. He's not talking about it from that perspective at all. What he's saying is that Jesus, like the firstborn child in a family, is the one who has benefited or benefits from everything that the Father has. He owns it all.
Well, in the fact that he's the firstborn mean that there will be others following after that are like him as well. So when he's the first fruits of a new creation, we will also follow him in that new creation as well. We will be new creations. We will. There's a verse that says that when we see him as he is, we will be like him.
That's right. There are other heresies which have found their way into the church
Well,
today.
well, before we get off the Arianism, though,
Okay.
like I knew you were going to bring up the Jehovah's Witness thing,
Yeah.
but hasn't Arianism also crept into liberal mainline Protestantism?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, tell me that some liberal mainline church treats Jesus as something other than a good teacher or like a guru.
Right. Yeah. Particularly, and you don't even have to. You don't have to go to mainline churches. We can also do the Universalist Unitarian groups as well. They have the same kind of idea. Jesus is a good teacher. He's a guru. Maybe he has some sort of divine spark or Christ consciousness, or however you want to term that.
Yep.
But
still just a man.
he's a man. Maybe he was ordained by God. He is some kind of a messianic figure. He's a good example, certainly, but he's not God in the flesh in the way that historic Orthodox Christians would believe that to be
Now,
true.
we don't necessarily think of that as Arianism when we encounter that at the local church that
Right.
that's more of on the liberal end of things, but isn't that Arianism?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's the same thing. And again, this is infecting the church today. And there are all kinds of people who actually have this kind of latent belief in the back of their mind. I was my wife and I, when we first planted the church here, there was a lady who had joined the congregation. She wasn't a member yet, but she was coming on a regular basis, and she wanted to be part of the women's ministry. And so we invited her to the house, and we sat down and talked with her and this sort of thing. And she began to express how she wanted to teach women. And so we did some sort of basic theological checking, just to see where she was at on that.
Number one, are you a weirdo?
Well, it got deeper than that. And it wasn't even as though we were checking her position on who Jesus was in terms of his divinity, but somehow it came up in conversation. I think my wife and I were saying something like, well, of course Jesus is fully God and fully man and something like that. And she kind of looked at me and said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "What do you mean? What do I mean?" And she said, "You just said Jesus is fully God." And I said, "Yes, that's what the scriptures teach and what Christians have
you ever read a
believed."
book that looks kind of like this?
Yeah.
That had
Yeah, and it was mind-boggling to me. And she said, "Where did you come up with that?" And I said, I didn't come up with that. God came up with that, and it's in the scriptures. And
That's interesting. What did she think she was going to teach in this study?
I don't know. So we immediately suggested that she not, she take some time to kind of develop things theologically and understand a little bit more about Christian orthodoxy and doctrine, because clearly she was not ready at that point to teach, but she didn't know. And to her point, her argument was, nobody ever told me. She said that the church that she had been at, the pastor had never preached this. Nobody had ever taught this. She had never heard it before. And so this was a completely revolutionary idea. And somehow she had managed to read her Bible or go to church or do Christian sorts of activities and never encountered this. So it tells me something about the state of discipleship and catechism and all of that's happening in the church today.
Did she stick around, or?
She stayed around for a little while, but she wasn't around for a very long period of time. And I don't think that was because of the conversation that we had. I just think that I don't think that she totally bought into what I was saying. It wasn't like a negative kind of a conversation.
She just sort of drifted away after a while.
She just kind of drifted away, and I don't know what that was all about necessarily. But it just struck me that she just didn't know. It never dawned on her. Nobody had ever taught her this before.
And think of the responsibility of the pastor she sat under for all that time. I mean, clearly shirking his duties. I mean, can you imagine sitting under someone's preaching for a number of years and they've never talked about the deity of Christ in any way whatsoever?
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak to how many sermons she had listened to or how often she attended or any of that. I don't know, who the pastor was, but she just had made this comment of, I'd never heard this before, and that just totally blew my mind. So I think that some of this is not just false teaching. Some of this is just no teaching, right?
Which is a plug for expository preaching through chapters of the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you don't miss that stuff.
Yeah. People just kind of imbibe the culture, and whatever they get along the way is what they end up incorporating into their theology.
Yeah.
So let's talk about another heresy, Pelagianism, right? The Pelagian heresy of the 5th century is a Christian heresy taught by Pelagius, which basically said that human beings are good, that there's no sin nature, we're not really fallen. Adam was just a bad example, and Christ is a good example. And if we just work hard enough and exert ourselves hard enough, we can be good, and we can be saved by our goodness. We can commend ourselves to God simply by being good people and doing good things.
And this one is also all through the culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, how many times have you heard someone say, "Well, I think people are basically good"?
Yeah.
If given the chance and the right upbringing and stuff, people want to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it also affects how you view what Christ did, what Christ accomplished. I mean, if Jesus just died as an example of selflessness versus...
That's just okay for me.
Yeah, versus an atonement, then
versus giving me the power to be good and to do the right thing, which I didn't have before he died for me and before regeneration happened.
Right. So it's a really big problem, and I would argue that there's probably more of this in the church than we're aware of people thinking, well, now, I believe in Jesus, I believe in God, and Jesus was a really good guy, and I just need to be more like Jesus.
I'm going to try really hard.
And God will love me more if I do more good things.
Yep. And I can imagine this working itself out in slightly different ways in different contexts, but still the same in many ways. You could imagine that perspective taking hold in a very legalistic type setting where it's like, I have to perform if I want to keep my salvation. You can also imagine it happening in a more, liberal context, the Unitarian example, they're perhaps either less legalistic or legalistic in a different way, we might say, but on that end of things, it's less, I'm trying really less that I'm trying so hard to be moral in a certain way, but more like, hey, I got to follow the good example of my guru. And I would say that's a form of Pelagianism as well.
Yeah. And this kind of, I think it raises another point, which is you can't be too careful of who your teachers are, right? I mean,
garbage in,
garbage out. Garbage out. I mean, listen to what Jude says. Jude 1:4. Jude says this, "Beloved, although I was very eager to write to you about our common salvation, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. For certain people have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were designated for this condemnation, ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ." So there he's talking about probably some kind of antinomian, lawless kind of heretical view where you can just do whatever you want to do, and God's grace becomes a license for sin. But the point remains that there are times when you see certain elements begin to creep into the church unaware. And before you know it, people are getting sucked into all kinds of different ideas. And it seems like his prescription for that is to contend. He says, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. The faith.
Yeah. Once and for all delivered. There was a body of knowledge that was conveyed that we neither add to nor take away from.
Yeah, and so in this context, I don't think he's talking about faith as being a personally subjective thing that you can sort of define for yourself. He talks about it as being objective, the faith that was once for all delivered.
He's talking about the doctrine of the apostles.
Yeah. Now, what do we do with that? We have to contend for it. What does that look like? Does that look like just kind of sort of sitting on our hands and just kind of watching as the world goes by? Or
it means you have to start a podcast right away.
Absolutely, 100%. That's part of it for us, right? I mean, one of the reasons why we're doing this is because we want to popularize some of the very heady and highfalutin kind of philosophy and Christian theology that feels like it's so out of reach for so many people, and they're just like, I'm not a smart guy. I'm not a smart woman. I don't have all this intellectual,
And who wants to read a 700-page book?
Yeah.
Not everybody has that capacity or that desire or the bandwidth for that.
I don't want to go to seminary. I don't want to, So one of the things that we decided would be helpful would be to take some of these things and bring them to the Christian culture in a way that people can understand it and sort of make it accessible to people. And so hopefully what we're hoping here is that folks that are online watching us right now or listening to us will subscribe to this channel, share it with their friends, and it'll become something that is helpful to an even broader community of people.
And utilize resources like Theo's Ark.
Yeah. So Anchor New England produce a fantastic animated cartoon that explains the cosmological argument to kids. So this is something that literally anyone can understand, and we're commanded to understand so that we can contend for it. We can make a defense. We can do our best to answer anyone who asks us for the hope that is within us.
And Scripture says to talk about these things when you go in and when you go out, when you rise up and lay down, and bind them as frontlets on your forehead, and the things of God should always be on our lips.
That's right. So let's make this part of who we are. Make it part of our routine, part of our culture. So I just want to wrap up by asking maybe a really practical question. Is throughout our conversation today, we've talked about the fact that many times these old ideas, whether it's Arianism or Pelagianism, find their way back into fashion. Speaking of contending for the faith, what are some ways that we can, as God's people, guard against heresy in the church today? Knowing that there are false teachers out there, how do we contend for the faith in a way that honors God?
Well, I was going to say enter into flame wars online with people and make sure you are highly critical of others, but then you kind of worded the question in a way to kill that thought. But I think for one thing, it has to start at home. I mean, make sure that your own kids are grounded in Scripture, grounded in classic Christian teaching. And, it really isn't good enough that that it's just you watching some preacher on TV. It's not. You have to be part of Christian community.
Right.
I mean, it starts there too, I mean, making sure that you're sitting under, the preaching of your pastor or your elders, but also making sure that you have Christian friends to whom you're accountable and they're accountable to you, and you talk about these things together. I'm a big believer in making sure that you surround yourself with people that are all going in the same direction on this journey. I can tell my kids, what to believe, but what's more powerful than that is the families around us who tell their kids the same things, and that creates this culture in which, these heresies are less likely to rise to the surface, I think.
Yeah.
So that's one way to contend for it, is strong Christian culture in our churches and in our families and in our communities.
I mean, that really gets at something that's so important, because it deals with something that's so fundamental. The family is the foundation. It's the baseline for everything in the culture.
Which is why they want to demolish it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's brilliant, actually. We have been distracted by things that are happening out there, and I think a lot of what we need to do is focus on what's happening within the four walls of the home. Kids are so often left alone to themselves, to find their own entertainment, perhaps spending hours and hours and hours online, playing games, watching TV, doing things that they want to do to entertain themselves. And how much time are we spending to combat all of the ideas that are infiltrating their minds with a Christian worldview? You kind of have to do some math there to say how much value are they getting from the discipleship that we're doing within the home, if we're doing any at all.
Right.
I think that's really important. So catechizing yourself, catechizing your children, studying church history. Don't believe, I wrote this one down, don't believe everything you hear on Christian radio and TV.
Search the scriptures to see if these things be so.
Yeah. So not everything we see out there is sound. Not everything is solid. There are tons of things that are floating around in Christian subculture that you just shake your head at and say, what is this?
But Benny Hinn
careful.
repented of the prosperity gospel, so it's okay.
Well, we might talk about it in a future episode. You mentioned something, test the spirits. John writes this in his epistle, to test the spirit to see whether or not it's from God. What do you mean by that?
Well, yeah, I mean, at the time that I brought that up, it was in the context of, some people treat that like some kind of weird spiritual warfare verse, as though like you've got your little Ghostbusters PKE meter and you're testing the spirits. But he means test the spirits of men to see what they're all about. And I believe in that same passage he says, if anyone says to you that Jesus did not come in the flesh, then
he's an antichrist.
Then he's an antichrist.
Yeah. Yeah. So they were dealing with their own heretical issues at that time, a la pre-Gnostic.
Yeah, and Docetism, and we didn't really touch on that, but that's kind of like the opposite cousin of Arianism, basically that denies the humanity of Christ and makes it seem like he was just like an angel or a spirit or something like that. Probably less of a common heresy today, although you could imagine that taking hold in
like
New Age or
yeah.
like a Course in Miracles
Sure.
kind of thing.
Yeah. Jesus was kind of an angel or whatever,
Yeah.
not fully in flesh.
Right.
So testing the spirits, super important. Learning theology, even at a more popular level, you don't necessarily have to break out, Berkhoff or, whatever Grudem or whatever systematic theology textbooks are, and read those cover to cover, but at least get yourself acquainted with theology, which is the doctrine of God, the knowledge of God, who is God. And then the last thing that I would just sort of mention is keep the main thing the main thing. Don't major on the minors.
I do like my rabbit trails, though.
Well, I have to. You'll find that I do a really good job of reeling you in and trying to keep you on point. I mean, rabbit trails are fine, right? There's a time and a place for it, and they're fun and whatever. But at the end of the day, like, what's the core of our faith? What is it that we're all about as Christians? Because if we lose that, we've lost the whole game. And if we're majoring on those minors, then we're actually losing the very thing that makes us distinct as Christians. Not that we're losing our salvation necessarily, but things can get distorted, things can get kind of out of place, and you could find yourself getting into some very unhealthy kinds of theological territory, let's say, if you're focused on some of those rabbit trails or things that aren't necessarily core Christianity. Any other thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience about heresies, or not that you have your own heresies or anything like that, but any thoughts about how we can just kind of be practical with this whole thing?
Yeah, you got to stay grounded in the Word, and hopefully there's no one in your family who doesn't realize that Jesus is God. I think, there's a lot of areas where heresy could creep in, but as you kind of noted, it really seems like having the proper view of Christ is the thing that holds all of that stuff together. And so realizing that Jesus is human and divine, a man with two natures, of the seed of David according to the flesh, but declared to be the Son of God in power by the Spirit, having that correct and fully orbed view of Jesus is going to go a long way toward keeping the creepy crawlies out of your view.
Mm-hmm. Amen. I think that's a great place to end it. I wanted to thank all of our listeners and those who are watching us on YouTube or on our website. Also, again, please like and subscribe to our channel so that we can promote this ministry and get this information out to a larger group of people. Until next time, we will see you on the next podcast.